not identify anyone by name, and he doesn't specify. He simply says that the Ahl al-Kalam are divided into two groups, the Ahl al-Kalam who oppose all hadith and the Ahl al-Kalam who oppose isolated hadith. And he never gives us a clearer idea of who they are. He does tell us that these are not specific records of individual debates. He says that so many people have said so much to him on the topic that he doesn't remember exactly who said what and exactly what he responded to in any particular instance, but he's giving an overall view of the doctrines of, or the opinions of these people and his responses. So he lets us know clearly that this is an overall view that he's giving us rather than attributing specific ideas to specific individuals. So he begins and he sets up the first two sections of his book in a debate format. He said and then I said, which is very typical of works of this period, Muslim works of this period. Qala li qa'ilan, or qa'ilun. And he says learned representatives of the school. So we don't know who these unidentified learned representatives are. But he opens, interestingly enough, with what seems to be the strongest argument that the opponents of the hadith that he's talking to raise, which is the idea that the Quran is in Arabic and that you're a speaker of Arabic and you don't doubt any word of the Quran. The idea that of not doubting any word of the Quran and that there's doubt in the Hadith. And furthermore, according to Shafi's rendition of his learned representative, his learned opponent's idea, that the Quran is tibyanan li kulli shay. And we see this argument continues later amongst opponents of hadith. So Shafi is putting that out there. He sets up first his opponent's argument, and then he begins to work through the arguments for why we need the hadith, why, in spite of this idea of doubt and in spite of this idea that the Quran is an explanation of everything, which is out of, I think, Surah An-Nahl, verse 89, why we still need the prophetic sunnah. And again, the idea is there's dispute over what obeying the Rasul means. So then Shafi says, don't you agree that we have to obey the Rasul? And the opponent says yes, because this, and we see this even today amongst the rejectors of hadith. They understand the idea of obeying the Rasul. They accept it. They have a different definition of it. So Shafi says, okay, you accept obeying the Rasul. So how do we do that? Well, the answer for the opponent is that we follow the Quran. If we follow the Quran, we're obeying the Rasul. And Shafi says, well, wait a minute. What about the idea? He brings chapter 62, verse 2, which mentions the kitab wal hikmah. And so once he's established the idea that we must obey the Rasul, which is where he begins, and part of the real effectiveness we see then of Shafi's arguments is that he uses the Quran, because he's talking to opponents of the Hadith who want to follow the Quran. That's their main thrust, is that we need to follow what's in the Quran. So what Shafi does is then take the Quran and bring up the point of obeying the Rasul. He gets agreement on that point. And then he brings up the point that the Quran specifically mentions in a number of places, al-kitab wal-hikmah. And Shafi asks, is this two things or is this one thing? And he records his opponent's response as, well, it could be two or it could be one. We say it's one thing. The wisdom is in the book, basically. So, and Shafi says, but what about the fact that it talks about in chapter 33, you'll forgive me, I forget which ayat, where the wives of the Prophet are told to recite in their houses what they've heard of the Quran, of the Kitab and the Hikmah. And so this indicates two things. So Shafi builds the idea that the Kitab and the Hikmah are actually two separate things.
You know, you are reading وَقَرْنَا as وَقْرَأْنَا, but that's not what the Quran says.
Okay.
No, واذكرنا ما يتلى في
واذكرنا من آيات الله.
You're right.
Recite what you in your home. Right.
Yes,
chapter 33. So there's there's a number of different verses. He starts with 62:2, which is the Kitab and the Hikmah, and then he brings in, when they argue that it's one thing and not two, then he brings in the idea that it's something that's recited, so there's two things that they've heard in their homes, which is the Kitab and the Hikmah. So he's using this to further nuance, because Shafi does a very step-by-step building of this argument. He doesn't just put the argument out there, he starts with his opponent's argument, which is a Quranic argument about the Quran being an explanation. And then he step-by-step builds his own argument. But he doesn't do it as one completed argument in his first sentence. He takes step by step and builds on different verses to build the idea that the Quran, the Kitab and the Hikmah are two different things. And that the Hikmah then becomes associated with the Sunnah. Now, one of the things that maybe I should have started out with earlier in the discussion is what Shafi sees as the role of Sunnah. Because Sunnah is an idea that was known to the Arabs, of course, before Islam, as the way people did things. Shafi's teacher, Imam Malik, accepted the practice of the community of Medina, which is now we use the word a'mal for that. But Shafi was dealing with people who saw Sunnah in a broader context. So one of the things also that Shafi did, and this is why he's so important, because all of these ideas are articulated by him in this and his other works. The idea that the Sunnah means not the Sunnah of the community of Medina, not a broader Sunnah, but the Sunnah of the Rasul. So he's not interested necessarily in the Sunnah of Omar or Uthman or Abu Bakr, people after. He wants to raise the Sunnah to the level of the Sunnah of the Rasul. And he speaks at great length in the Risala, which is another of his works, a treatise on jurisprudence, about the role of the Rasul and the importance of the Rasul as the one that God sent to humanity and the one that needs to be obeyed. And here in the Jima' al-Ilm, moving back to the work that's the main point, he puts the qawl, the saying of God and the saying of the messenger. He says there's only two things that everybody is required to obey at any time: the qawl of Allah and the qawl of Rasulullah. So the idea that the authority of the messenger goes with the authority of God, and this ties in with what Brother Israr was saying in one of the earlier sessions, that there is this co-equal authority and that everything else is subordinate to these two qawl, the qawl of Allah and the qawl of the Rasul, and that nothing else is binding. So he raises the idea of the Sunnah beyond the Sunnah of the community to the Sunnah of the Rasul. And then the Hadith, the Akhbar, become